From the Green Belt to the Red-Green Alliance. How two historic miscalculations in the West contributed to the underestimation of political Islam. One of the most important questions in international politics is why parts of the West have continued to adopt a relatively cautious approach toward the Islamic Republic of Iran, despite decades of documented human rights abuses, systematic repression, and support for militant proxy groups. The explanation cannot be found solely in oil, trade, or diplomacy. It must also be sought in two historic miscalculations that emerged in different periods but ultimately led to the same outcome: an underestimation of the authoritarian nature and long-term potential of political Islam. The first dates back to the Cold War, when communism was widely regarded as the West's greatest strategic threat. Within that context, elements of the Western security establishment viewed religious Islamic movements as a potential counterweight to Soviet influence, an approach that later became known as the Green Belt strategy. Western support for the Afghan Mujahideen and cooperation with conservative religious actors across the Middle East reflected this strategic thinking. The fundamental mistake was the failure to distinguish between Islam as a religion and political Islam as an ideology. What appeared to be a useful instrument against communism in the short term eventually evolved into a challenge for both the Middle East and the West itself. The second miscalculation emerged after the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and was reinforced following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Within parts of Western academic and cultural circles, anti-imperialism, identity politics, and criticism of the West's colonial legacy became dominant analytical frameworks. While this development contributed to important advances in the fight against racism and the protection of minority rights, critics argue that it also led some observers to view Islamist movements more as forces of resistance than as carriers of authoritarian ideologies. The Iranian Revolution illustrates this misunderstanding. The French philosopher Michel Foucault famously described it as a new form of political spirituality. Yet events soon demonstrated that opposition to the West does not necessarily translate into a commitment to freedom, democracy, or human rights. The revolution in Iran quickly gave rise to an authoritarian political system founded on political Islam. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, a new political landscape emerged. Parts of the traditional left shifted their focus from class struggle to identity, multiculturalism, and criticism of Western colonialism. This intellectual transformation produced valuable progress in addressing discrimination and defending minority rights. However, according to critics such as Pascal Bruckner, Gilles Kepel, and Douglas Murray, it also fostered a tendency to judge certain Islamist movements primarily by their opposition to the West rather than by their commitment to democracy and human rights. It is within this context that the concept of the Red-Green Alliance emerged. The term does not describe a formal alliance, but rather a convergence of interests in which elements of the anti-imperialist left and certain Islamist movements share criticism of the United States, Israel, and the Western-led international order, despite holding fundamentally different values. As a result, authoritarian Islamist actors have in some circles been perceived more as resistance movements than as ideological threats. This development has had both foreign and domestic political consequences. Internationally, several European governments have continued to view Iran primarily as a regional actor that can be managed through diplomacy and economic incentives. Critics argue that this approach has, in practice, prolonged the survival of a regime that has itself been a major source of instability in the Middle East. Domestically, Europe has simultaneously faced growing challenges related to religious extremism, parallel societies, and identity-based political conflicts. In response, right-wing populist, and in some countries far-right, movements have gained significant support. Europe therefore finds itself confronting two parallel challenges: Islamist extremism on one side and increasingly radical counter-reactions on the other. The central lesson is that political movements should not be judged by whom they oppose, but by the values they uphold. Opposition to the West, colonialism, or a foreign power is not, in itself, evidence of a commitment to freedom, democracy, or human rights. Viewed in historical perspective, political Islam appears to have benefited from two distinct Western miscalculations. The first was geopolitical, the belief that Islam could serve as a strategic bulwark against communism. The second was intellectual, the tendency to interpret political Islam through its anti-imperialist rhetoric rather than through the authoritarian nature of its ideology. Although these two approaches emerged from different historical contexts, they ultimately arrived at the same mistaken conclusion: a profound underestimation of the authoritarian potential of political Islam. Mahmoud Ashkanian, consultant psychiatrist, Ph.D.